The Star Traveler found an ancient human radio. He thought the music was our final goodbye. The ground cracked open and the device fell out before I even touched it. I had been drilling into the third subterranean layer of this planet for 4 hours, and the sediment gave way all at once, dropping a corroded metal object directly onto my boot. I stepped back. My scanner swept over it. Power signature detected. Faint, but alive. 2,000 years buried, and something inside it was still running. I picked it up with both hands and turned it over. It was roughly rectangular, with a circular dial on one face and a mesh panel stretched across the front. Primitive electromagnetic receiver. My translator identified the construction materials as iron alloy, polymer composite, and a copper wire coil wound around a ferrite rod. The craftsmanship was unsophisticated. The object was clearly from a civilization that had not yet discovered faster-than-light communication. My name is Vale Soren. I am a xenoarchaeologist, 3rd rank, working under a contract from the Galactic Archival Society to catalog the remains of a planet listed in the registry as System 4902, Class M body, formerly inhabited, species extinct. The species entry said, humans, bipedal, carbon-based, lifespan approximately 80 cycles, civilization classification, early industrial, cause of extinction, disputed, likely ecological collapse, unremarkable. I had cataloged 17 dead civilizations before this one. They were all, in their own ways, unremarkable. I pressed the largest button on the device. It turned on. Not metaphorically. Not in a residual signal fading ghost kind of way. It turned on clearly and completely, with a small orange light appearing on the panel, and a hiss of static filling my helmet's audio feed. The internal power cell had apparently been designed to outlast everything else on the planet. I made a note of that. Impressive engineering for a species that had not yet left its own atmosphere when it built the thing. Then the static cleared, and music came through. I stood very still. My translator identified the sound as structured tonal composition. Acoustic instruments, string vibration primary, wind accompaniment secondary. The tempo was slow. The tonal pattern registered in the minor scale. I ran the emotional classification algorithm without thinking about it, the way you do when you are trying to stay professional, and the algorithm returned. Melancholic, ceremonial, terminal. I dictated into my field log. Artifact appears to be an audio storage and playback device. Content suggests the humans used it to record and broadcast emotional compositions. Current playback is consistent with a mourning or farewell ritual. Species likely composed music as a psychological response to their extinction event. Cataloging for cultural analysis. I set the device on a flat rock and went back to digging. The song ended after approximately 4 minutes. Then another song began. This one was faster, much faster. A driving percussion rhythm underneath. Voices layered over it in a way that my translator flagged as communal, energetic, possibly celebration-related. It was loud. It was almost aggressive in how much it insisted on being heard. I stopped digging. Then that song ended and another began. Slower again, but different from the first. Something in the melody that my translator could only describe as longing. Not sadness exactly. Something more specific than sadness. The kind of feeling, the algorithm suggested, that occurs when a person wants something they cannot have but has not yet given up wanting it. I sat down on the rock next to the device. I told myself I was conducting acoustic analysis. My field notes from that hour contain almost no data, just the word strange, written in my own notation system, approximately 11 times. The planet had no name in the registry, just a designation. But the longer I sat there with the music playing and the gray sky above me and the cracked, half-recovered ground stretching in every direction, the more it started to feel like a place rather than a location. The reforestation layer had confused me earlier. I had found it about 40 meters down, sitting above a layer of severe atmospheric contamination baked into the geological record. My initial interpretation had been straightforward. Industrial collapse, toxic aftermath, extinction. But the reforestation was not natural regrowth. It was planted, deliberately, systematically, on a planetary scale. Someone had poisoned this world, and then spent generations trying to heal it. I went back to the archive drives I had pulled from the deeper strata the day before. I had been avoiding them because they were dense, and my translation matrix was still calibrating to the human language set. But the music had put me in a different frame of mind. I opened the first drive. My scanner swept the storage capacity and returned a number that made me recalibrate it twice, because I assumed it was an error. It was not an error. What I was holding contained more stored data than the combined archival output of the last 4 civilizations I had studied. Not because the humans had better technology, they did not. They had relatively simple compression methods and storage formats that my system had to work to decode. They had simply decided to save more. Far more. Everything. That was apparently the decision someone had made at some point, to save everything and figure out what mattered later. And so I was now holding the everything of an entire species. It took 3 hours to process even a fraction of what was stored there. They had saved everything. Not just scientific data, not just political records, not just the things you would expect a civilization to preserve for posterity. They had saved poems, personal letters, audio recordings of people laughing at things that were apparently jokes, though my translator struggled with the humor, paintings, thousands of them, digitized and compressed and filed alongside engineering schematics and medical research, a collection of recipes, annotated by hand in at least 40 different languages, maps of cities, drawings done by children, photographs of people holding other people at events that the metadata described as weddings, birthdays, graduations. They had saved all of it with the same care and the same urgency, as if every piece was equally important, as if nothing could be left behind. I found a hospital that had been built inside what used to be an art gallery. The structural scans showed the original gallery walls still standing, and the medical equipment had simply been moved in around the paintings rather than removing them. Someone had treated sick people under paintings of rivers and mountains, and had apparently found that perfectly reasonable. I found graffiti on the outer wall of what my scans identified as an old government building. 3 words carved into the concrete with something sharp. We were here. No signature, no date, just that. I photographed it from 6 different angles. I told myself it was standard documentation procedure. My hands were not entirely steady when I held the scanner. Around the corner of that same building I found something else. A small garden, completely overtaken by 2,000 years of wild regrowth, but the original layout still visible in the geometry of it, the spacing of the root systems that remained underground. Someone had planted it intentionally, with fruit-bearing trees arranged around a central seating area. In the middle, half buried, was a stone bench. Carved into the back of the bench were names. Not titles, not dates, just names. Around 30 of them. Adults and children based on the naming conventions my translator recognized. I did not know what the bench meant. A memorial, perhaps, or simply a place where people had wanted to be remembered as having sat together. Either way, someone had thought the names were important enough to carve into stone and leave behind. I sat on that bench for a few minutes. The music kept playing. I had stopped pretending I was going to turn it off. The songs came one after another with no pattern I could identify. Long ones, short ones, gentle ones, furious ones. My translator kept returning classifications. Triumphant, grieving, romantic, angry, playful, reverent. One song it could only describe as a structured argument in melodic form, which I found oddly accurate once I had listened to it twice. There were songs sung by single voices and songs sung by hundreds of voices at once, and the difference in weight between them was something I registered physically, in a way I could not quite explain to myself. I had been a xenoarchaeologist for 63 cycles. I had catalogued the death sites of peoples who had built wonders and peoples who had barely built anything at all. I was not sentimental about it. Civilizations rise and fall. That is the fundamental law of the universe, as reliable as gravity and far less pleasant. But I kept not being able to close the archive drives. The extinction record, when I finally found it, was not what I had been taught to expect. There was no single collapse event, no one catastrophe that ended them. What there was instead was something the humans themselves had called the Long Reckoning, a period spanning nearly 300 cycles, during which their civilization had fractured, bled, nearly broken, and then pulled itself back by degrees. They had poisoned their atmosphere and then built machines to clean it. They had fought wars and then built institutions designed to prevent the next ones. They had watched disease tear through their population, and then engineered medicines that bought them another century. They had survived themselves. By the time the stellar event occurred, a sudden expansion of their star's radiation output that made the surface uninhabitable within a single generation, the humans had already outlasted every projection in the galactic registry by nearly 200 cycles. The registry said they should have been gone by then. They were not gone. They were still building things, still composing music, still sending transmissions. The stellar event was not their fault. It was not their failure. It was just the universe, doing what the universe does. Indifferent and enormous and unbothered. What struck me most was not the survival itself. What struck me was the documentation of it. The humans had recorded every step of their near collapse and their recovery in obsessive detail. The arguments, the failed attempts, the policies that made things worse before people realized they were wrong and reversed them. The scientists who published data that their own governments tried to suppress. The communities that kept planting trees when the broader civilization had not yet decided whether it was worth doing. None of them were certain it would work. They did it anyway, and they wrote down everything they felt about doing it, including the fear and the exhaustion, and the times they believed it was already too late. And then, in the records from the final 2 centuries before the stellar event, the tone changed. Not to relief exactly, something more complicated, something like the feeling of knowing you survived something that should have ended you, and not quite being able to trust it yet, but continuing forward regardless. One of the archive files was a personal journal kept by a woman named Clara Weston, who had worked as an atmospheric restoration engineer for 40 years. Her final entry, written when she was very old, said, "I do not know if we fixed it in time. I think we might have. I hope whoever comes after us, if anyone does, finds a green world and wonders what we were like. I hope they find something worth wondering about." I found her journal in a planet with a recovering ecosystem, surrounded by deliberately planted forests, with her words backed up on drives designed to outlast the planet itself. She did not know if it was enough. It was enough. I sat very still for a long time with that information in front of me. Then I started my field log recording and said, "The species classification in the registry is incorrect." I stopped, started again. Humans did not constitute a failed civilization. The category does not apply. They were an unfinished one. I stopped the recording again. I am Sorinathi. We are not, as a species, given to emotional disruption. We live for approximately 400 cycles, which gives us a long view on things. We are methodical, we are precise. We do not, as a general rule, sit alone on dead planets in the gathering dark, talking to ourselves about species that have been gone for 2,000 years. I sat alone on a dead planet in the gathering dark and talked to myself. Then I found their last transmission. It had been broadcast from 3 separate deep space relay stations simultaneously, pointed outward in a broad arc away from the planet, sent just before the evacuation fleets launched, which meant that in the final days before they left their homeworld forever, someone had decided that the most important thing to do was broadcast this. It was not a distress call. It was not a warning to other species. It was an introduction. It said, in language that took my translator the better part of an hour to render accurately, "We are humans, from the 3rd planet of this system, and we want you to know that we existed. Here is what we were. Here is what we made. Here is what we loved. Here is what we argued about. Here is what we were afraid of, and here is what we did about it. We are leaving this place now. We do not know if we will survive what comes next, but we know we were here, and we know it mattered, and we would very much like the rest of the universe to know it too." And then they attached an archive. Every drive I had been reading, all of it, sent outward into the dark because they had decided, with a confidence that I found staggering and a little bit incomprehensible, that someone out there would eventually receive it and would care enough to listen. I looked at the radio. The radio was still playing. The current song was soft, a single voice, accompanied by something that sounded like strings, singing in one of the older human languages. My translator caught only pieces of it. Something about a river, something about home, something about not being afraid of the dark anymore. I do not entirely know what happened next. I know it was not something I planned, or would have predicted, or would have reported to the Xenoarchaeological Society under any circumstances. I know that my helmet's interior environment logging system recorded a small but measurable increase in ambient moisture at approximately that time. I know that I did not move for 6 minutes. I know that the song was more than my emotional shielding was built to handle. That is what I know. When the song ended, I sat there for another few minutes in the quiet. Then I pulled up the sealed archive partition I had been avoiding because it was flagged as evacuation records, and I cracked it open. The colony ships had launched, 4 of them, carrying approximately 80,000 people and everything they could fit into the cargo bays and a significant proportion of the archive I had just spent 2 days reading. The ships had scattered across 4 different star systems, following trajectories that suggested they had planned ahead, carefully, with the kind of organized desperation that only comes from knowing you have one chance. The Galactic Registry listed the surviving human communities under a single entry: remnant population, scattered, status low significance. I read that phrase 3 times. Low significance. I looked around at the planet, at the reforestation planted by people who knew they had already caused damage and chose to repair it anyway, at the hospital built inside an art gallery, at the graffiti that said we were here, at the archive drives full of recipes and love letters and jokes I did not quite understand, and paintings of rivers and songs about coming home. I opened a new document and began composing a formal petition to the Galactic Archival Authority. I am not a political being by nature. I do not file petitions. I file field reports and catalog entries, and the occasional academic paper on sediment stratification techniques. But I had been a xenoarchaeologist for 63 cycles, and I had credentials, and I was going to use every single one of them. The petition requested that the human species be reclassified from low significance remnant to protected cultural heritage, and further that their scattered communities be formally catalogued, and their archive be given permanent preservation status in the Central Galactic Library. It was 4 pages long. It cited 37 individual artifacts and discoveries from my excavation. It was, I believe, the most aggressively detailed document I have ever produced. I sent it before I had time to reconsider. Then I packed my equipment. I kept the radio. I told myself it was an artifact for further study. I played it on the shuttle home. I played it for the entire 14-day journey. My co-pilot, a geologist named Owen Barry who had been with me on 3 previous expeditions, asked me what I was listening to on the 3rd day. I told him it was field research material. He listened for a few minutes and then went very quiet and did not ask any more questions, which I considered the appropriate response. It took me 2 weeks after returning to the station to locate the surviving human communities. There were 3 of them, spread across the outer periphery, none of them particularly easy to find because they were listed under administrative categories like migratory non-aligned community and unregistered habitat cluster. The largest one, living on a converted deep space platform near a quiet binary star, had a population of around 42,000. I sent them a message. I attached a copy of the complete radio archive, restored and digitally repaired from the original recordings. I attached my excavation data. I attached a copy of the petition I had filed, though that felt slightly self-congratulatory, and I considered removing it twice before ultimately leaving it in. The message I wrote was 3 sentences long. It said, "I am a xenoarchaeologist. I found your music on your homeworld. I wanted you to have it back." 3 weeks passed. I had largely convinced myself that they would not respond, or that they would respond with something formal and administrative, or that I had misread the whole situation entirely, and the music was in fact just a primitive sound storage mechanism with no cultural significance whatsoever. Then the response came. It was a single audio file. I opened it and a voice came through. A woman with a low, clear voice and an accent that my translator identified as a regional variant of the Southern Hemisphere. And she said, "We did not think anyone was still listening. We have been out here for a long time. There are not many of us now, but we have not stopped making things. We made something for you." Then the music started. It was a new song, not from the archive, new. Written recently, my metadata analysis confirmed, within the last several months. It was built around a simple melody that kept returning to the same 4 notes before opening outward into something larger. It sounded, according to my translator's classification, joyful, grateful, and slightly smug. I sat at my desk on the station with this song playing through my speakers, and my petition still open in another window, and I thought about a species that had poisoned their world and healed it, that had built hospitals inside art galleries, that had sent their entire identity into the void on the calculated bet that someone would eventually care, and that had now, 2,000 years after leaving their homeworld, still had enough left in them to write a song for a single alien archaeologist who had spent 2 days sitting in the dark listening to their radio. Owen knocked on my office door and asked if I was all right, because he said I looked strange. I told him I was conducting acoustic analysis. He looked at me for a moment. Then he said, "Do you want some company for that?" I thought about it. I said yes. We sat there together listening to the song that the humans had made. Owen is not Sorinathi. He does not have the same emotional shielding. He cried openly within about 2 minutes, which I noted without comment. The song ran for just under 6 minutes. When it ended, we both sat quietly for a while. Then Owen said, "What are you going to do now?" I said, "I am going to go back." He said, "To the planet?" I said, "To the humans, the living ones. I want to tell them what I found, what the planet looked like, what was preserved. I want to tell them about the hospital and the graffiti and the archive drives and the radio that was still playing when I got there. I think they deserve to know that the things they left behind survived, and I think they deserve to know that it worked." Owen said, "What worked?" I said, "The calling card, sending the music out. They were betting that the universe contained someone who would eventually listen and understand that it mattered. They were right. It just took a while." I filed my expedition report the next morning. Under the species assessment section, where the form had a drop-down menu offering options like extinct, remnant, or displaced, I selected the 4th option, which was intended for civilizations in a recovery period. The form asked me to provide justification for the classification. I wrote, because they are still making music. And because when you send something into the dark and a stranger finds it 2,000 years later and cannot stop listening, that is not a goodbye, that is an introduction. The conversation has barely started. I booked passage to the outer periphery on the next available transport. I brought the radio,